contributing to the creation of that knowledge as a way then of having a voice in the public sphere. I think that it's important to recognize, though, that those of us who have created this voice or who have take up space in the public sphere in this way, do so for a lot of different reasons and in a variety of different ways. For example, I don't consider myself a pundit, and I don't consider myself partisan, but I do consider myself someone who has contribute to understanding what are often complex issues that affect our lives as Canadians.
Yes, thank you. And before I start, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm on Mi'kmaq land, and I respect that. I'm originally from Nunavik, I should say, but lived in Nunavut for many years. And it's wonderful to be back here at Mount Allison, where I was here for a full year, where I started the intensive work on the book, but also working with the students, and that was just remarkable. So I'm happy to be here, making a full closure. So thank you for the invitation, Crystal and Aretha, for being here. Yes, there's a lot going on in terms of trying to relay the message out in the work that I have been doing over the course of many years now. And certainly, I think it is the voice, the maternal voice within me that really has, been very strong as a result of the challenges that we're faced with in the Arctic. And of course, it all started off where I hit the ground running when I got elected to the international body of ICC to represent our people on the international stage. And at the time, many of the huge challenge at the time was dealing with toxins that end up in the breast milk of our mothers and our bodies as a result of toxins that end up in our food chain from far away. And immediately, that was the maternal instinct in me as a mother and a very soon-to-be grandmother at the time, dealing with these issues. How does an Inuk woman who's been elected to represent her people get that kind of message out that's so urgent that it's not just a scientific story or an environmental one, but one of health, first and foremost, for the people of the Arctic, and of course the same issues of environmental degradation when it comes to climate change. How do you put that kind of human face and that kind of maternal protecting of a way of life that has been so profoundly important, not just to my era and my lifetime, but knowing that and the connections that exist around our youth who are struggling in this new world order of globalization. So those voices have had to really escalate and really profoundly become stories that try to connect the larger public on what these issues are really about, that they're not just about science and they're not just about the climate and they're not just about polar bears, but they're really about families and children. And that's been the challenge of the work, but at the same time has brought, I think, about some of the ways in which people can grab something in those terms of their role in all of this, not only in terms of understanding it, but in terms of trying to move forward with these issues that are so important. And so it's about Arctic issues, but it's all about all of us. Yeah.
Well, I think as a writer, as a poet, you mostly work with the intimate life. And I think I would like to see different lives that we have. The intimate life, which is your own life. You create your own narrative, you create not necessarily your own values, but where you want to go. It is at the same time a dream life and a narrative life. You better not make mistake in the narrative you tell yourself as well in your life. There's another kind of life with which you work also very strongly, which I would call la vie intérieure, the interior life, which is not the intimate life. That's very different. The interior life would be what you get from the world, from the outside, and what you recycle and retransform, and what you use to make new proposition to the world. And then there is what has been called the private life. But the private life is not that private. For example, if you make love, what you think belongs to your intimate life. But the person you make love with belongs to your private life. But in your private life, there's a relation with that life and the legal or illegal life. So your private life somehow is géré, how would you say?
Managed.
Is managed by the political life, by the laws of the cities. And so and then it will, the laws of the city will determine if the person you're making love is legal or illegal in relation to your life. So for me, it's always very important to, you do it naturally, but it is important to make a distinction between those lives. And so when feminists of the second wave said private life is political, it was very precise. I don't know how much they knew how precise it was, but it was really precise.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think picking up on some of what you're saying about the maybe false opposite of private-public, but also what you said, Sheila, about being elected to represent. I'd like to ask you a question about that, ask all three of you, how your public work has been affected by different affiliations or locations that you've chosen or that have been ascribed to you. So I'm thinking of the way that at times one might choose to position oneself as speaking on behalf of or advocating for a particular institution or group, or the way that you might be pegged as speaking on behalf of or advocating for a particular group. So to what extent do each of you conceive of your work as being representative of or advocating for a particular location or people group? And I mean that widely. In what instances are you thinking of Quebec or the North or women or academia or something more global? And how does that affect your public voice?
I think Sheila should start.
Well, I was elected to represent our people on the international stage, you know, for 160,000 Inuit in the world where we live, in Alaska, in Canada, in Greenland, in Russia. And so you have a political mandate to, and a responsibility to go out there to the world to ensure that the rights and interests of Inuit of the Arctic are well represented at the tables and the international forums, such as the United Nations or the Arctic Council or other forums where your way of life is being impacted, whether it's the toxins in our food chain or the CO2s in the atmosphere that's causing the melting. And many other areas, such as the Arctic Council, where sustainable development is discussed and decisions are made based on the assessments that are done, you know, within the northern countries. But again, you know, it sounds and looks and feels like it's all about the Arctic, but in reality, whatever is happening in the Arctic is very much connected to the rest of the world and the rest of the planet. The ecosystems are all connected in powerful ways. And so in signaling the message of the challenges that we've been faced with in our communities, and continue to have those challenges, it's been really important in my own messaging as well, because I really believe this, is that whatever happens in the Arctic happens first, but it is a matter of time. And in fact, many of the things that we have been trying to say over the course of the last decade, 15 years, the reality of it starts to become very stark and real today. And an example of this is when we used to say, and I said many times over the course of the last 15 years, if you protect the Arctic, you save the planet. Or if, as the Arctic is melting and the glaciers are melting, especially the Greenland ice sheet, other places in the world are sinking. And when you watch the National the other night on Florida, an example that I used to use in my speeches about 10 years ago, it was very eerie to see that it's happening today. And so, again, it's to try to deliver the messages in a way that people can say, no, this is real. This is not theory. This is not in the future. The challenges that we face in the Arctic are today, and the impacts are today. And so that kind of messaging of allowing people to see that it's not some, okay, these people who live in the north, they hunt seals, they wear furs, but I can't relate to that. What I've tried to do is bring the dynamic of our shared, you know, human dimension. And of course, by bringing in the issues of human rights and how climate change definitely is a human rights issue. And by using that and bringing in that, you know, the doctrine of collective human rights is what brings us all together. Because as I protect the environment and the way of life for us in the north, in the Arctic, then it's really talking about all of our rights. And so in that way, I think it's an important piece to, you know, in terms of that kind of messaging has been, I think, effective. And it's a way, again, of bringing in others around the world who have to collectively address these issues. We can't work in isolation, and we certainly have to bring in people to understand these issues that are not separate, where, you know, media can tend to separate them. Oftentimes our own institutions tend to separate them, and certainly our governments tend to separate these issues of industry, environment, economy, as though they were all separate parts, when in reality they're a holistic part to the well-being of not just the people of the North, but to all of us as Canadians and all of us as citizens of the world.
Yeah. Do you feel that the Canadian public hears that, or do you have moments where you feel like that's being heard, or is our dominant attitude still...
Absolutely. I mean, everywhere I've gone, including here at Mount Allison, when I delivered the lecture here and taught the students were like so eager. They were like sponges, you know. They hadn't heard about the context of the Arctic and the challenges we face, not just in terms of environment, but even the historical traumas that they had not heard about. And they just became completely open to learning more, and what can they do as part of, you know, this younger generation. And they helped me set up the lecture that I delivered here that was streamed out. It was just a remarkable time, and it's those pockets of the younger generation, students, but also people out there in the world that just are eager to hear. And so the citizens, I find, can be much further ahead than our own governments in terms of wanting to do the right thing and addressing these issues in the way that they are able to feel like they are part of the solution.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Lots more to do, but we're getting there
but still,
slowly.
hope.
Slowly,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So just to return to the question and to let the other two address issues of representing or advocating from a particular location, how you...
Well, as I said before, I work with La Vie Intérieure, a intimate life. But you're never only one person. Huh? I am a woman, I am a lesbian, I am a Québécoise, I am a poet, I am a mother. You are many things at the same time, and depending on the moment of your history, the focus will be made on part of yourself. If you make that focus in a certain way, it will probably echo into someone else, because they are more Québécois, they are mothers, they are lesbian, it echoes. And everyone reading or hearing the poetry somehow will take whatever is meaningful for them. So you can become the advocacy, I don't know the expression, for many different parts of yourself which go into society. And but the main thing is that I have always said that I write for myself. But I'm not a Martian, and therefore there will be 5, 10, 100, 200 person more that will be interested, and then a dialogue can be made on values, on the changes that we have to make. I've always said also that there are two kinds of writers, probably the writers of the childhood who work a lot with memory, and the writers of the adolescents who work more with rebellion, sexuality, transgression, and so on. And I think I belong to the second category, which would be the adolescent writer, which would be the character, for example, of Melanie in Mauve Desert, and so on. So you are many facets of yourself, but writing, in a way, is a way to create that c'est la femme intégrale, the integrity of what you are.
Yeah, the wholeness.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you have to do it again, all over again, but always with more consciousness.
Yeah. When you say that you write for yourself, does that mean that when you're writing, you're not imagining a public
Not very much, I have to say. Not very much. When you write with your body, you write with the readings that you've been making, you write with what makes you angry, what gives you pleasure, what gives you joy. And I have to say that actually, well, when I was 20, lots of things were making me angry, but today I have to say that every morning I am a happy person, I have a happy life, but every morning I wake up and after half an hour reading a little bit, I am angry. And being angry means that you need to understand why. But the problem is that everything is so obvious. I mean, I think Margaret Atwood was talking, it's so easy when it's good and when it's bad. But now we know for a lot of things in reality that they won't be good for us. And we know, and people keep arguing about that and making problem to us as citizens, not only as women, but also as citizens to the different groups that we belong to. And so that's what writing is also about, is processing emotion et des sentiments into language. So once it has been processed, it can belong to all of us.
Most days I wake up and read the paper and say to myself, I have to go teach this stuff now? I can't believe it. So that's the interior life. So there's a lot of layers, but in terms of the question about how do we get into the roles that we're in, I'm not an advocate. I don't have anything to sell. I only have ideas to share, and hopefully insights that help understanding. And what's very odd is that I'm now a commentator on Quebec. And so that's fine. I'm from Quebec, and I grew up in Quebec, and I went to Université Laval, and I think I understand Quebec, but I wasn't trained as a Quebec specialist. Actually, I went to University in the United States. And when I was studying Canada in the United States, Quebec was part of what Canada was. When I came back to Canada, I realized that a lot of my colleagues who studied Canadian politics actually didn't even know about Quebec. And so this kind of rattled me, that you could be a Canadian politics specialist without actually knowing anything about Quebec. And so I was almost thrust into the role in many ways, not because I felt I had any kind of special insight, but because so few of my colleagues were actually able to explain Quebec, to understand it and put it into context. And the first time I was on TV was the eve of the 1995 referendum, where you would think there would be a panoply, so there would be a host of people who would be able to comment on this, but as Sherry Graydon told us yesterday, you pick up the phone, and if they invite you, you say yes. But I said yes to CNN. So I had no idea what I was getting myself into, except that I realized at that point in time that there was a message that needed to be sent, not only to Canada, but in fact to the world. There was a world that was watching, that wanted to know what was going on. And from that moment on, I decided that that was going to be part of my role, was to explain and unpack that complexity. The same day, the CBC called me and wanted me to be on a panel where I was going to take position X, and somebody else was going to take position Y. So it was going to be a he said, she said, and I said, no, I'm not interested in doing that because I'm not advocating for one side or another. I'm not an advocate for the ideas that you're putting forward to me. So that was the lesson that I took, was that if I want a voice, I want that voice to be one that can explain, unpack, communicate, and not one that will be, kind of being punditry as I'll take this position and you take the other, and let's have a fight.
But my question then would be, how long can it go on that you or someone doing the same kind of research or thinking would always be in the position to explain? I know as a feminist, we had to try to figure out how patriarchy worked and how it functions and how it can transform itself and renew itself and so on, and how can you transform it. But when you say you are trying to understand a problem and explain it, but my question is, when do you decide that, well, you will remain on the explanation, even though as citizens, we might have a good idea of the problem that this answer could give, like voting, for example, in
So
2015.
Yeah, so here I'm going to bring Sheila in, because what I really like about this session is also the title, translation, and so I see my role as translating in a way. So I translate Quebec politics to the rest of Canada. I translate complex issues and try to break them down. The question about when that role becomes one of actually engaging, from where I am as an academic, has to come from evidence. So if the evidence is showing that X is better than Y, I'm absolutely comfortable with saying that. Sheila is showing us that things are going on in the Arctic, right? We can't stick our head in the sand. We can't be doubters, right? So in that sense, when the evidence comes forward and we can actually then try to explain the evidence, and what's really important when we're on the stage here or in the public is the honesty that goes along with bearing the evidence, right? So we know that truth and facts get disassembled all the time. So when you have a public voice, it's a responsibility. The way I see it is a responsibility to that evidence and to those truths.
But do we have to wait for the evidence?
So a scientist would say yes. I don't know.
Are you thinking of a particular example, or
In terms of ecology, in terms of the petroleum going on the St.
We have a
Lawrence
lot of
River
evidence.
and things
We
like
have a
that,
lot
it's yes. We don't have to be visionary, definitely, but somehow we have a lot of material to be informed of a certain kind of dangers. And if there is no action before the fact or before the evidence, then the evidence will come and will get it in the face, as it's more and more often happening, whether it's about erosion of democracy or whether it's about ecology and so on.
well, and that's I think
In terms of scientific, and I'm not a researcher or a scientist, but it's that precautionary measure. We don't have to wait until disaster strikes to take action, and I think that's what you're meaning, is that there has to be some form of action that we start to take before the disaster actually comes, because, as you say, it's common sense and wisdom, right? It doesn't take a rocket scientist, not to. Where's
Even though
the
we
young
know
lady?
we have one.
Where's the young lady? No, I just met her, and it's not a joke about her whatsoever. But it doesn't take that to know that the evidence is already there, and so and I can somewhat relate to you, although you may think, oh no, really? You kind of put that forward out there very strongly. But I can relate to you in terms of that whole debate issue, because I don't go on to, for whatever reasons, I just don't feel like I should go into panels that are going to be butting heads and fighting about things. That's not who I am. That's not how I do things. But at the same time, I'm very clear about my strategies behind being so public about these issues. And I think for me, you were talking about, the public messaging and so on. For me, I use the tools that lie in front of me in a very strategic way. I use my head a lot with how am I going to get this message across in a world that barely knows who we are, much less the kinds of challenges and the historical context upon these struggles of high suicides, violence, and abuse, and all of that is occurring, and on top of that, the environmental degradation that is now, imposing itself on our world once again. Having been in a life where I remember the day when I was traveling by dog team, I remember the day when we didn't have suicides. This is in a very short period of time. So when you do have that kind of, opportunity to make strong, solid sound bites, as you were mentioning, and to be strategic about using the tools in front of you, you're clear in your head what you need to do, but you speak from the heart. This is the balance that rings much more truer for me. I don't throw out one or the other, but I use that kind of in the absence of a better word, that very action-oriented, male-oriented kind of, above all else kind of thing. But we women can do that too, and that's perfectly fine. But it's also honoring those pieces that you talk about, honoring, whatever parts of us that speak to us. And for me, it has been, as an Inuk woman, as a mother, a grandmother, who have seen that in one lifetime, these dramatic changes, and what could happen, and the slowness of the world, as you say, without, before disaster strikes, that seems to want to wait until all the evidence is in. Well, all the evidence is in many of these cases, and we've got to take that action now. But it's using strategically focused, this is what I want to accomplish, so that the world can listen and hear and better understand and embrace these issues, so that they can see themselves, as you, again, seeing a lot of things you're saying in terms of the book, that they can see themselves in the message in some way, that they are in it, and I think that's an important piece there to remember.
Just picking up on this idea of using the tools and the strategies, and you mentioned sound bites, I think maybe sometimes our go-to image of the public intellectual is someone who would be called to give a soundbite on a news story, for instance. Something kind of quick and fleeting that's perhaps based on lots and lots of research, behind giving that opinion. How do each of you think about these different kinds of public engagement? So some things that seem quick, like commenting on a news story, but other things that we might think of as slow, putting out a publication, for instance, that you've worked on for years. How do you think about those different tools as you're referring to them?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about sound bites are, and I'm sure the other people on the panel know this, it looks like a soundbite, or it sounds like a soundbite when you see it on TV or hear it on the radio, but usually you've been interviewed for like half an hour, and that 30 seconds is what is the soundbite, right? So it sounds like a soundbite, but we don't actually think in soundbite terms, or even speak in soundbite terms.
So maybe the quickness is the turnaround with which we no longer engage with it through the media.
And the slicing and dicing that goes on in the editor's office, and that's for written work as well. But I think there are different venues and different vehicles or tools, as Sheila suggested, give you a different way of doing that. So if you're being asked a question on a specific issue, you answer it as best you can. If you're on a panel, you marshal arguments, or you bring what you have to bear to play on that stage, as we are doing this afternoon. And then often, if we're also asked often to write things, to be a little bit more thoughtful about what we have to say. And that, again, it's a different kind of a work, and it's a different kind of reflection. My own work in terms of my research, and I see this a lot with my colleagues as well in the academy, is that our research is not necessarily compelling on its own. It's compelling in the context of something else, right? So I work on healthcare. It's compelling in the context of a debate on election, right? So what are the issues that Canadians care about? It's compelling because the Minister of Health announces that there's going to be a reorganization of the healthcare system, then it becomes compelling. So it has to, in many ways, as knowledge workers or as members of the academy, we have evidence and articles, scientific, that we can bring to bear in a context. Whereas the other kind of work you do as speaking in a panel, or as you say, again, answering specific questions in a soundbite, is another way of doing it. But one of the things that I know my colleagues try to move away from, and I mean, this relates a little bit to what Shari was saying yesterday, is that yes, you pick up the phone, you'll answer the question, we should be taking up more space as women in these kinds of debates and all of that. But what I try to shy away from, and most of my colleagues, is we don't want to be known as minute rice experts, right? So there's a problem, call X, and she has something to say on everything. Like, nobody wants to be pegged the minute rice expert, right? Nobody wants that. You want to be the expert on things that you care about, that you have something to say, and that you can make a contribution to.
It is funny because as a person, as a citizen, I think that the anger that I was talking about is also related to the fact that whatever is the news, most of the time, well, probably as an intellectual, I feel that I have to take a moral decision on the news immediately. I have to take an ethic posture on the news that I'm hearing, because every day something nonsense happens. And you say, okay, now what's that nonsense? You try to figure out. And nonsense is just like when it hurts. For example, you discover many things. If something hurts or if something gives you an incredible joy, it brings you into nonsense for a moment or for a longer time. Then you have to question. This is where you're starting to become an intellectual. Why does it hurt? Why does it bring joy? And then you have to get some information either through your own experience or through your surroundings, whether it would be books or friends or conversation or even arguments and so on. And then once you've got some materials that confirm your way of interpreting your pain or your joy, then you want to talk about it publicly, and you go on publicly through a book most of the time, because it is through books that you can really discuss and think and take all the time needed to think, and then you move into becoming an activist after that. An activist or a politician, because your conclusion might bring you in politics, or as a consultant, or in politics directly, or might bring you in prison, depending on the country you're living in.
Thank you. It seems like we've been talking about reactions and emotions, hope, anger, joy. I would really love to hear you all talk about what you're seeing in Canada today that makes you worried or that makes you joyful about the status of women's voices in public conversation and in public space.
The status or the women's conversation?
Either. I think, well, what I would most be interested in hearing about is maybe where you're seeing progress or community developing, or I don't know, if you see young women at the beginnings of their careers, are you reminded of yourself, or do you feel like there's been change?
Go ahead.
I can say that in Quebec, I can see a young generation of women who are about 35, becoming very feminist, some of them very radical. And because we always skip a generation, because the daughter doesn't want to do what the mother has been going on and talking about. So we skip a generation most of the time. So now it's the granddaughter, and they read again the text written in the end of the 70s, early 80s, and I can see that movement taking shape. On the other hand, I can see the propaganda of the patriarchy every day, every month, every year, because it's so funny, but I mean, someone must decide what part of their body women will be showing this year. Sometimes it's their legs, sometimes it's le ventre, sometimes someone must decide, c'est la mode. Huh? And so it keeps on working all the time. And at the same time, it even has taken women's way of doing things like negotiating, making space for the other. It does. The system does that falsely, but it pretends to be kind to you somehow and making space to you as on the other way, it's taking away your space of thinking and of becoming, of using at least all your possibilities, your inside possibilities and so on. Yes, I see a young generation, a continuation, but on the other hand, I see that the patriarchal propaganda is much stronger. And I see also a different, I think the women of my generation, we tried really to understand how, as I said before, how patriarchy worked. And I think that, and very often we took a lot of risk in our saying and in our proposition, because a lot of these women were also radical, lesbian, and so on. Now I see a new generation of women, but very angry against men, but without the analysis. They're just describing the reality and say, you are abusing us because of our body. So it's the same thing we had said, but it's said in a much more, I cannot say pornographic way, but in a much more artistic way, let's say.
Okay.
I don't know if you've been able to follow me.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
Yes, I mean, I see this in even in some of our own communities in our context, that even through even the older generation, not necessarily the younger generation, but if you look at the history, or if you look a quick snapshot of the Inuit world, Alaska, Nunavut, Nunavik. Many of the women and the younger generation are starting to stand up to address these issues that I've been working on for many years, and many my own age have been doing this as well. That it seems to be the women who are standing up more courageously about the protection of a way of life or the protection of the environment in those terms. And I suspect some of it, of course, is our own maternal instincts to protect the next generation. Certainly for us culturally, that has been the case. And I'm not suggesting that the hunters aren't, because the hunters are the ones who are the most impacted by the changes that are happening out on the land. But at the same time, there's been more of a displacement of the hunter and the hunter spirit in our world than of the women, who have been able to sit back, reflect, talk about some of these things and the struggles that we face. And in the institutional world, when our men are brought into the institutions and either become, and I'm not trying to generalize, but we observe this and we talk about that a lot in our groups as women, and say, well, how come our men have been left so far behind in terms of being able to adjust and to adapt to some of the situations, and why is there so much violence that's created by the displaced hunter spirit? And so we talk about that in terms of not being critical for the sake of it, but for trying to understand the root of all of these, the horrific things that have happened, not just in terms of the external historical traumas that have happened in our world in a very short period of time, which most Canadians aren't aware of: the forced relocations, the collapse of the sealskin market, children being sent away at the very young age, including myself at the age of 10, losing our language, having to gain it back, people who were very sick and being sent away and died in foreign places where families never knew where they were buried and still look for them today. Forced relocations up to the high Arctic of families. I mean, I taught all of these things while I was here at Mount A, and I've written extensively about them. But it is about trying to find our rightful places wherever we may be. But yes, the women and the younger women in particular are starting to really stand up and start to be more courageous about questioning, for example, the resource extraction that is happening. And it's not just the women, because there are, of course, some of the hunters are now standing up and launching lawsuits, which is, wow, never thought I'm just so happy that it's happening, to be honest, because I've really been trying to get people to look at the rights-based approach to development in the Arctic, so that we can really look at this for what it is in terms of our right to culture, to educate our children, to safety, to see all of those things that are so important in a melting ice. And so there is that movement that is happening more. It's much more encouraging. But again, it's hard because the jobs are not there. And so many of our men leaders and many of our leaders in general are wanting those jobs very desperately. And so here we are in this place again with that one carrot that's being dangled in front of us, trying to make the choice of a job, putting food on the table for your family, knowing full well that the very land that you've held sacred for hundreds of years is what you're digging up. It's huge. It's huge for us, not just in terms of, the poverty that lies in our communities, but can you imagine the choice that we're now being given once again? Just like when we were struggling with the toxins in our country food, it's, choosing between our country food and our cultural heritage. What a place to be in. And now with the melting of the ice and these new companies coming in by the hundreds and thousands perhaps, in and out of our regions to explore and exploit, is once again we're in this place where because of the melting ice, the jobs that are being created are not of our choosing. They're not our children who are going to be choosing their passions and using and based on the strength of our culture and the ingenuity. We are the people who invented the chaya, which is replicated all over the world, And we are the people who build homes out of snow warm enough for our babies to sleep in. We have ingenuity, in our core. And why couldn't we tap into some of that? And those things I write about in the upcoming book. Because we're now being, again, funneled or channeled into this one direction that is part of the larger issue of our atmosphere collapsing to begin with. So how ironic is that the Arctic is now being used as the, going to be the super feeder, energy feeder for the world, as Inuit try to feed their own families in a way that we feel we want to maintain. It's a tough place to be. But there is movement, as you say, going back to your question, that there are the young women that I see, the ones who have been championing Joan Scotty for years against uranium, Sandra Inutik, who's been instrumental in raising the voices on protecting.
Yeah.
It's coming, but we have a long ways to go.
Thank you. Well, stay with us. I think both of you want to say something as well. Just to let you know that after these comments, I'll be taking questions. So if people want to start coming to the mics, go ahead.
I just want to say how much it is interesting to listen to you, because you use the word nature and myth and our body and this ingenuity and so on. In Quebec, in the early 60s, we used the word we are being exploited, dominated, and colonized. And with those three words, we tried to understand who we were, what was our identity. We had a Canadian passport, but didn't feel Canadian. We were speaking French, we were not from France, and we were North American, but we were not from the United States. And we tried to define gradually in regard to language, in regard to economy, in regard to politics, who we were. And in that same sense, I would say that women and men, women with feminism and men with nationalism, we grew almost together. Maybe we have 5 years of difference, but we grew in terms of finding out who we were and who we would want to become almost together. And so les hommes Québécois men had really to listen to what women were saying, because it was, and at the same time, the Quebec men never had political power. If you go in France, the feminists had to subdue their theory to psychanalysis, to sociology, to Marxism, and so on. We didn't really have to subdue our theory to any other more important theory. And that's why probably feminism could pass through the veins of history differently than in Europe.
So this reminds me that my most important job as a woman is raising 3 sons in Quebec. So that's I'm hopeful when I hear Sheila speak. I'm hopeful in many, many ways, but there are many things that trouble me. One of them, in sort of the larger issue of women in Canada and women having a voice. So some of you know, this is my second time to Sackville. So 30 years ago, I came to Mount A when I was on the student council. I spent a few years at St. Mary's University, and I was on the student council as the external, rep. And so basically meant I had to visit every college and university across the Maritimes. And what triggered a little bit of distress in me is that at lunchtime, you're having this national leadership conference because there's not enough women in student legislatures, and I'm thinking, what happened with the past 30 years, right? So when I started college, and thanks to people like Nicole, women in the 80s were in university, and we could do anything. That was the message that was sent to us, was we could do anything. We realized soon enough that wasn't necessarily completely true, that you did have to make choices in life. But what's amazing to me is that 30 years later,
We don't have gender parity in our legislatures. We've had a female prime minister for 5 minutes. And we really don't have the presence of women in the echelons of power. And I don't mean just in corporate boards and all of that. I mean in any, in decision-making capacity in a number of different kinds of institutions. I don't understand how this can be possible. This was not the message that was sent to us as women even in the 1980s. And when I look out at my students at McGill University, the majority are now women. And my question is, what happens to these women, right? Professional schools are now at least half, if not in some cases, the majority women. What happens to these women? So there's something else going on. And it's really, I think, about the whole culture of women and work and family. This is an evolutionary process, right? This is an evolutionary process about what the role of women are. We were actually not given that much space until only a very few years ago, right? Our space was very constrained. And now trying to make sense of a larger world and to take up our space in that world, I thought, frankly, it would be a lot faster than this, but I realize that there's some evolutionary things in the way that we set up just business, the way we set up work, the way we set up society, that it's going to take a lot longer, much longer.
And the modeling just doesn't exist.
Just doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
But one thing also, for the first time in history, it is the first time in history that young little girl, young woman can make a choice. But it is not everyone, men or female, who are able to, who have a desire for something to realize in their life. When it is a man, sometimes it doesn't show too much. When it is a woman, it shows a lot, because she will be refrained in the domestic sphere and not move from there. But it is a problem. The problem is the passion, the eagerness for something in life, which will make you move earth like you're doing. But it is a new phenomenon for the young women to have the possibility to become whatever they would like to become. Those possibilities are there. Then there is a fight to do after that, but at least the possibilities, the space is there. And that's the problem, is the space is not used presently.
And I had just very briefly just mentioned, and the modeling that's not there as well, and or very little of it really. And so we have to be constantly breaking ground wherever we go in those terms. And one of the things that and again I write about this, is that I was raised by 2 single women, my grandmother and my mother. There were no fathers in my house, and no grandfathers either, so I have no awareness of what that would be like. And so in a time when my grandmother, when my Scots grandfather left, was left to raise 2 small baby girls, and she was expecting her third. She had to give up her second. And this is in the 1920s, in order to feed the other 2, because everybody else was still out in the outpost camps, And then my mother, repeated the same legacy, and was a single mother of 3 children. And so I think that kind of modeling is not just out there in the corporate world, but also have we seen that in our own family structures as well? What allowed us to take some of those courageous steps, as we were going forward, to make some of those changes also, is something that has been very, very helpful for me, and certainly for 2 Inuit women who, were able to not just survive the day in the 1920s and 30s, but thrive and offer to their children in the far north the possibilities of girls and women being able to stand up. But always, and again, it wasn't an easy step, as you will see, but it's also because then we were part of the other big force that was coming, that would take away that voice, and take away the sense of Inuitness, and take away our language and all of that. and the historical traumas that would come. And so you have to kind of find that place within yourself that you once knew as a very young child that you were modeled for, and just try to break through all of these barriers and come out and be the person that you're meant to be. But those are personal, you know, but because my poetic friend here is so wonderful with her words in terms of the person and the, you know, all of that, I join that song a little bit in adding those pieces, because for me personally, it has been the survival instinct of my late grandmother and my late mother, two Inuit women in the Arctic that really did survive and thrive and allowed their children to be safe and go through that tumultuous first rapid change that happened in those worlds. So the modeling aspect, I think, is very important for us, not just in our family systems, but in our community and beyond as well.
Yeah. So we're talking about, it seems, the persistence of separate spheres, even though we thought maybe that access to education was going to change that. Is there kind of a more fundamental change that needs to happen? And you've described really eloquently sort of the possibilities of modeling strength and kind of potential strength coming from foremothers, which is an important point. Big questions. I'd like to open it up to other questions. Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I just want to pick up on this last part of the conversation. There are 3 stages to my thinking right now, so bear with me. I do think there's a distinction of degree, a difference of degree in the kind of experience that young women had in the 60s and the 70s, and the kind of experience they have today. And it's a difference which affects all of us, which affects what Sheila has been talking about, which is this exploitation of the earth up there. And that is consumerism. And I see consumerism not only as a system, as a structure, as a set of practices, but also as a set of effects on people. And my sense is that one of the lethal things about consumerism is that it has clamped our notion of pleasure. And so I do recognize the colonial patterns, the patriarchal patterns. You'd have to be blind not to see them. But I think that today we experience those oppressive structures more insidiously. And that's where I'm going then to Nicole Brossard's poetry. Part of the reason why I read your text, for instance, is that there's this reflection on the body. And Kabbalism has this clamp on the body. We talk about this, we discuss this in class with my students. And I do know that there's no point in shaming anybody's, young girls, young students, about their makeup, about their short dresses, and so on and so forth, because it goes much beyond than that, right? So this is now the 3rd stage. I'm just wondering, through your practices, your work, your reflection in health, your research, or your work in the North, or in your poetry, I'm just wondering if there is something common to you, and that is, I was going to use a word, but it has been vilified, at least in academic terms, and that is a reflection of on what makes us human in all kinds of ways, in our relationship to the earth, to our body, to others, to political structures and systems, and so on and so forth. So the obvious word, which is taboo, is humanism. And then if we don't want to use that word, you know, what makes us human, basically? And finally, we celebrated the person's case today. That's another way of putting it, right? What makes us persons? How we relate to others, to ourselves, and how we renew our capacities, because that's endless, it's an endless process, to be persons, it seems to me. What do you think?
So just very briefly, there's quite a bit of literature, or there's work that's been done on, for example, why women don't engage in politics more, right? So why do we have so few representatives of women why is it that the higher you go in political echelons, the fewer women you find? It's a famous book by Sylvia Bashevkin. And some of the explanations are, so there's a variety of different explanations out there. Some of them are structural, economic. You can imagine what they could run the gamut. But some of them do reflect on the fact that politics is shaped as a male almost sport, right? So this idea that's why we always have these sports terms to refer to politics, right? It's the horse race, it's this, it's that. And it's the idea that the way that that game or that sport is played is something that women are not either comfortable in or want to engage in, right? And so that, I think, I've never really thought about that a lot. I mean, so this is one of the explanations among many. But certainly, if you're thinking about, what's my life about? Do I want to spend my life? Do I want to spend my time? Do I want to spend my energy engaging in this game, which, frankly, not only do I not like the way it's played, but I don't actually believe that the way it's played is useful pour mon épanouissement personnel or for the good of society as a whole. So I think those are questions that I think women think a lot more deeply about when they come to terms with engaging more fully in a public role.
Well, both of your questions were important. Pleasure is a word, indeed, that we don't use very often because we use mostly the word work. I mean, in English you say, are you still working on it? Meaning that you're not finished with your dish or something like that. So work is an obsession as pleasure. And the thing is that most of the time people go to work, they sleep, they go to work, they sleep. And when they can have some pleasure, there is a religion somehow that tells them, no, 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 you won't touch that, no, no. So you have to create and invent your space for pleasure as well. In pleasure, what I was saying about who decides about la mode every year, it's the notion, it's not the notion of spectacle, as the surrealists did. And the women who were going out with the surrealist artists or writers, instead of engaging directly in their own work as photographers or artists or writers, they engage in dressing in a very spectacular way. They were respected for that because they were very original, and so they could be respected. But they were not doing what they fundamentally want to do, which was to be a great photographer, a great artist, and a great writer. And probably you will say what makes us, what is our humanity? Our humanity is moving in the sense that we remain the same, we have the same difficulty to live in an harmonious way, but at the same time, individuals can change. But the humanity for the moment has not changed. But it will soon, because you'll get your nanotechnology and it will change soon without noticing it, of course, at the moment. But as we have changed with neoliberalism for the last 20 years, well, if you're 23, maybe you don't know, but if you're older, you will know that you've changed, and it's not because you're getting old, it's also because you've changed your relation to time, to space, to your body, to the notion of health, to the notion, we've changed. Alors, l'humanité, it's the same, but now it's the first time that we can manipulate our gene, and therefore science and technology cannot mean the same thing as they've always meant since the beginning, since the wheel, since the printing, and so on. We are manipulating ourselves, and therefore our humanity, and probably we'll even lose what makes us artists, which is our melancholy.
We could take another question unless you want to comment on that, Sheila? Or,
No, I think there's two people here.
Let's go to this mic then, please.
I'd like to begin my question by recalling that Antonia said at one point that she likes to have sufficient evidence on hand before she will come away from a neutral position and actually take a side or take a position or be other than sort of above the fray. But then I want to circle around and say that in one of your concluding exchanges, you did something that I think is quite typical of women and that the other two conversationalists here have been describing. And Nicole particularly has been talking about the smaller version of this, the more intimate version of gathering knowledge from la vie intime, from an intimate life, from a personal life. And Sheila has been talking about the experiential knowledge of herself and her peoples. And then, so the way I tie this together is to say, and then Antonia asked the question, what is happening to all the women I see in these classes, which is experiential, right? You're seeing them all, and you're noting that so many undergraduates are women, so many women are in professional schools now that they dominate numerically. So what is happening to them? And I think that in that process, we have a really good example of the way women start thinking about public problems, because your question is based on your experiential knowledge. You may now gather other knowledge. And I would suggest that one of the things that's happening to these women is that they are all now becoming unemployed, or vast numbers of them are becoming unemployed, because law jobs are being exported to India, because there are no longer medical jobs in certain specialties, because state medical insurance will not pay for procedures that those doctors do, that there are all kinds of teachers now unemployed because governments no longer fund these positions. So the pea is under a different walnut shell now. We don't have to watch out for where educational opportunities are. We have to look at what capital and what governments that are related to capital are doing about jobs. And so from your question, which was based on your own personal observation, you then go to collecting evidence. And I would suggest that what I have just said is evidence from my experiential knowledge as a teacher, as a mother, as an advocate, whatever. And then we may add more knowledge to that. And before long, when that question has prompted the gathering of sufficient knowledge, we get advocacy and we get, public speech. And I think that where we place ourselves on the continuum of women in public life depends on how much knowledge do we need to feel comfortable taking action. Your earlier statement suggested that you felt that you needed quite a bit of knowledge to take the action of stepping out of the neutral position, whereas it seems that your colleagues on the panel here are satisfied to take an activist position on what an academic person might consider to be less knowledge. And if you wish to comment on those observations, I'd be happy to have your comments. It just occurred to me that in this discussion, you really have all exemplified the way women sort of organize ourselves to see things and take positions on them.
Thank you. Would any of you like to pick up on that?
I thought that was very good intervention. That was very good observation.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Mary.
We say no more.
Okay, we'll go to this mic.
Hello, everyone. My name is Selena, and I'm actually a student here at Mount Allison, and I'm currently enrolled in a psychology of gender course. So this is all very interesting to me, and I have a question for the entire panel. And I would basically like to know, as women in public life, what you would say to young feminists in Canada. A lot of the course we talk about is how young women are afraid to identify as feminists in Canada, and I would like to know in one sentence what you would tell them.
Oh, I think you better
If you're
start.
a feminist, you're brilliant. You understood.
So we have not only a question about what would you say to feminists, but a formal restriction of one sentence. It's like a Twitter.
That's
Yeah.
fine. One
Just
sentence
to keep
is
it simple and move along.
Any other words of inspiration for these young feminists?
Take up more space. I live with men. I live with 3 boys, a dog, and a husband, all of whom are male. And I grew up with women. I had never, mothers, grandmothers. I went to a convent school, where my space was always constrained. It was my own space.
Yeah.
And I see these guys, and they just take up all the room. They take up all the room in the house, all the room in the bathroom. They spread out everywhere, and they have loud voices, and they make noise. Men take up space. So I think women should start taking up more space.
Count yourself in. You know, you have much to offer from where you are, who you are as a woman. You have much to offer in a world, I know, that is just filled with many men who are in control. There's no doubt. In the work that I've done over the years, I mean, in every boardroom almost, even at the international level, I would be one of the rare women. In my world, very few of us are elected in those positions. More and more today, yes, but count. Make yourself count.
Thank you very much.
Shelley?
Hi. My question is very quick, but I feel like it may expand. But I will be very, very quick. All 3 of you spoke about translation in one form or another. Nicole, you talked about translating your feelings from the morning newspaper into intellectualism and then action. And Sheila, your work relies a lot on translating cultural knowledge into a language that works in the discourse of power, right? So you have to translate this knowledge of what's going on within a specific subculture, within a marginalized people, to a language that can affect change. And you spoke about translating policy into something that is understandable to a broader audience so that they can make decisions. I'm wondering, with all this translation, does anything get lost? What gets lost in translation as you're translating?
Me, I've been always interested in translation, but for literary and identity question. In translation, something gets lost, but in terms of feminism, but probably gets done. And that's why it's so important, the tone and the diplomatic approach that women will use in politics. Something gets done in translation. Get lost, but get done, and then gets reminded again and gets translated and gets done, up to now. And where it doesn't get lost, it's when you write directly the book. Because in the book, that's the space of freedom. We were talking about space. It's a space of freedom. If you translate yourself too much in the book, you're not there. You have to be there. And what people will be reading, it will not only be words, it will be your energy that you are giving. So in the book that you write, well, metaphorically, we are always translating each other, even when we speak the same language, because it's difficult to understand each other. What does she mean? Ta, 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 ta. So we are translating all the time, even when we speak the same language. But when you write, if you are translating, it is without noticing it, or over noticing it, and then offering maybe a work of art which has many layers to read and so on. But translation remains important because it allows you to, well, as what's the first translator who was translating in Mexico, someone must know.
Crowdsourcing here.
She was translating Cortés, and therefore she was allowing...
Louder.
La,
Malenchi?
voilà, c'est ça, voilà. C'est ça.
Thanks.
So translation is getting also into politics and avoiding massacre and avoiding many things also.
I think that we will take these last two questions tomorrow. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to go back to the very important and eloquent intervention that Mary made, which I found interesting that none of you wanted to engage with directly. My question is in some way similar to what Mary articulated, and it's addressed to Antonia. I wonder what circumstances or conditions would compel you to shift from your notion of the scholar as translator to a slightly different position that may involve advocacy or some kind of intervention? Or do you think that the role of the scholar is exclusively to be one of translation? Yeah, that is for you, Antonia. Yes, yeah. Thank you.
So the question is, if I understood you correctly, Samaro, what might compel you to move towards thinking of yourself as an advocate or engaging in advocacy?
I thought being advocate of truth was enough, but I guess it's not. The way that it's shaped. So right now, my role is an academic, right? So this is the way that my public role, je le puis, so I go for it. From what I am in my day job, which is an academic. So that's the way I kind of construct my public persona and the way I see my public role. I've tried, so I mean, I'd be dishonest not to say that I haven't been attracted by politics or that political people haven't come to talk to me about becoming an advocate for their party or their policies or whatever, but the crucial thing for me is that I don't see the world through the lens of one side or another in many ways. And I don't think that's something I have to defend. I think that's something that comes from the way I try to unpack and puzzle through arguments or issues. Many people in the academy like to solve puzzles. That's what we do for a living, right? It's like puzzles, like, you know, the angels on the head of the pin and all of that stuff. And I like to solve problems. But I try to solve problems by coming at what are the, what is leading to this problem? What are some of the alternative solutions out there? What kind of capacity is there to be able to answer or to affect change in this particular area? That's the way I come to see things. And I've realized, having studied politics for 30 years, when you see the sausage getting made sort of thing, having studied politics, that the political realm is not necessarily the place where that's done, right? And so for me to become a partisan would be having to, in effect, abandon some of that, the way that I like to observe, or the way I think I'm best at observing and unpacking and sorting through problems and solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like when you identified as a knowledge worker at the beginning, you're talking about bringing incredible knowledge and resources to a public, students or public, and thinking about, I guess, raising awareness and transferring knowledge on things you know about.
In a different way. So, but on the other hand, I see people in this room, like Mary Eberts, like Sheila, like Nicole, being advocates in probably a much more powerful way than I could ever hope to. But it's a different way.
Thank you. So we'll have a last question. Aretha.
It's hardly fair for me to ask it, but I can't, I have to. Before I do, though, I've been asked to tell you that we're going to just proceed to the next and final panel. So if you'll have a stretch, and then we'll just go on. My question, thank you, that was a marvelous panel, is a kind of a cruder version of Smaros. When do we translate our anger? And what do we do with anger? We've avoided it, but you said it, Nicole, so thank you. I too am angry every day. How do we use that? Can we deploy it usefully? And I'm sorry to ask you such a big question and to say, can you give me one word or one sentence? And take up more space is, of course, one good answer to that.
Well, I don't know. It is a good question. I mean, when I was 20, I was angry, and I think we've changed things. I mean, we've written, we've thought, and we've acted, and I think we've changed things. Now I am angry, and for example, if I think of almost the 6 months of Les Carrés Rouges in Montreal, that was important. It transformed the election, but then after people went back to the Parti Libéral, so in order to somehow, maybe without knowing it, but they should have thought it will accelerate simply the neoliberalism and so on. So, and you see what's happening in Hong Kong, what has happened also. So when people are showing their anger publicly and in group, for the last 5-6 years, it's been proven that the situation at the best normalized or that the situation got worse. So this n'est pas très encourageant. It's absolutely, and therefore you meet a lot of angry people. Sometimes they will go demonstrating, but most of the time, and probably the only answer would be keep on trying to figure out how you are contemporary, the world you are living in. And that's, for me, that's my answer, because that's what I did all my life, was trying to figure out how it functions and the way I live in. That was my way to be not, I took party, but at the same time, I needed to understand how that dangerous machine was functioning before, because that's the main tool. If you know how it functions, then you can deal with it differently as well. So anger, but pleasure.
Other thoughts on anger?
Well, for me, being angry has a purpose. There is a purpose to getting angry. If it mobilizes you to do something and to act on something, not necessarily angrily, but you allow that anger from within to start to shift and translate into action that is going to help the situation, whatever it is that you're dealing with. But if it's paralyzing you to the point where you're powerless and you've become a victim to your anger and to the situation around you, then it's not helpful. And I'm coming from a nation that has the highest suicide rates in North America. So you can imagine the rage inside most of the young men and the men, and now women who are taking their own lives. This is unshed grief, from the histories of these horrific historical traumas that have happened and the way in which we've been treated over the history. And I won't go into detail in all of those, but that's a preview of what you will read next March, part of anyway, from my lens. So anger for me has been helpful in just getting me to really become aware of my feelings and how I feel about what's happened, not just in my own childhood, but in the collective memory of my grandmother, my mother, everybody who has been there struggling in a cultural setting that we were less than everybody else and therefore had to be changed and had to be sent away and had to be, made into fur traders and everything that was against our essence of who we were, And so it's important to get in touch with that, to find out where is the root of that, so that you're not just carrying your own anger, but you're also most likely carrying your ancestors. But then deal with all of these issues and work them through And at different parts in your life, you start to understand and piece these things together. But it can be a powerful vehicle in which to move the issues into places that can be very clear and concrete. And so for me, it's really important that I understand that if I'm going to lead a campaign on these issues that is trying to make it a better world for our own people who are so negatively impacted by the historical traumas and have the highest suicide rates in North America. So, but as a woman and as a mother, it's important that we not model this powerless victim place of being angry, you know, and not being able to do anything effective as a result of it consuming you. There's a difference. So you can use that, as you say, you use it and use it in a way that can free you from the actual root of this powerless feeling of being angry about life and issues. And you know, just very quickly, my son, who's an adult, and asked me the question when I was launching the petition against the United States for their inaction on CO2s, the legal petition on connecting climate change. He said, "Aren't you pissed off at Bush and his administration?" I said, "No, I'm not going to give him that much power. I have enough anger to mobilize me and do what I need to do, but I certainly won't remain angry, because it was the power was in the actions, you know, that triggered me to do what I had to do, but not in being angry I didn't have to demoralize or demean or demonize anybody while taking those kinds of actions. But you know, it's a process, and in life that you check in, you know, with these issues, and you work them through as much as you can.
So injustice should make us all angry. My anger, so as Sheila was talking, I'm like, that's right. The reason I have a public voice is because there was anger about something. I was angry about the crap I was reading about and listening to on Quebec. I was just tired of the crap. So I decided to do something about it, and I developed a public voice around it. And I think my mantra now about how anger helps me do that is, and I read this on a greeting card, it's not original, is do no harm, but take no crap.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That's a good way to end this complete.
So, just by way of wrapping up, I'll remind you, just as Aretha said, that we're going to have a really quick turnaround for the next panel. I've also been asked to remind you that these events are being streamed at mtalive.ca, where you can also watch them later on. This conversation has, to my mind, been absolutely compelling. Please join me in thanking our three conversationalists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. You too. You too. It's been great.
Folks, don't leave. What we're going to do is change mics right on the stage, and we're going to continue right on with the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.